Hello, this is Rulebreaker, and today we are going to go over the melee rules for Game of Thrones, the card game, 2nd edition. To play the melee game, you're going to need more than 2 players, and you're going to need these titles that come in the core game. You're also going to need to be familiar with the regular rules, the joust rules. So if you don't know how to play the 2-player version of the game, the kind of the main version of the game, I recommend you go and look at my how to play video, which will cover the main rules of the game. For this video we're just going to focus on specifically the melee multiplayer rules. Each player is going to need their own deck. For the purposes of this demonstration we're going to do a 3-player version of melee with 3 decks. If you don't know how to make a deck, I've also made a video about basic deck building, which I'll link here. But I'm going to assume that you've been playing Joust a few games and know how things are going for the rest of this video. So the melee game works very much like the joust game. Let's just assume that this has been after setup, maybe it's a couple of rounds into the game. Each player is going to have their plot deck of cards that they've got to choose from. Once all 3, in this example, players have chosen, they reveal them simultaneously. Our Baratheon player has chosen a Clash of Kings with a really high initiative because they've got no power and they want to get some to try and win the game. On the other side of the table, the Lannisters have chosen Counting Coppers, and the Tyrells have chosen Warden of the South. The initiative on this guy is 3, and the initiative on this one is 4. So our Baratheon player has the option of going first, or choosing a different player to go first. We're going to let the Baratheon player go first. The Baratheon player can then choose whose plot card initiates first, and then it'll resolve all the other ones in clockwise order. In this case, the only one that has a when revealed effect was the Lannisters, and that will happen first because it's the only one with an effect. And then once plot cards have had their effect, we get to the title phase, which is the main difference between joust and melee. Because our Baratheon player has chosen to go first, they will get to take the 6 titles like so, and will be the first to choose them. However, depending on the number of players, there are certain rules about how many they can choose from. In our 3-player game example, what we're going to need is the number of players plus 1 in titles. So 4 titles, basically. The reason for this is, maybe if any of you have ever played the classic Bruno Faidutti game Citadels, there's a little bit of intrigue involved in choosing your titles and not wanting the other players to know them right away. So for the case of a 3-player game, we shuffle all the titles up. 2 of them are randomly removed, and the first player gets to look at the 4 that are available. Let's just say that the Baratheon player decides to take the Hand of the King. They will do this but not show any of the other players what they've chosen, take the other 3 and pass them to the next player. Our Lannister player, being the 2nd player in the order, takes these 3 cards, looks at them and chooses one of them. I think the Lannister is the Master of Coin, so let's give him that one. And like the Baratheon player, this player chooses it, puts it face down, takes the remaining cards and passes it on to the other player. The 3rd player in our game is the Tyrell. This player gets the final 2, will look at these and decide which one they want. I'm thinking maybe Master of Ships, and the other one is thrown out of the game. We now have a kind of a discard pile of 3 that weren't used, and each player has 1 left. So let's take a look at the Master of Ships in detail. So there's quite a lot of detail in here. There's supported by in really small text, supports, rivals, and effect, and this kind of passive ability that goes on throughout the round. There's a lot of information on this card, but when you know how to read it, it's really straightforward. Let's focus mainly on supports. So this card supports the Master of Whispers. The Master of Whispers was one of the cards that was thrown away in the round. So that means that this player does not support any of the other players. It rivals Hand of the King. The Baratheon player chose Hand of the King. So what that means is that these players are rivals. Now I'll explain what that is very soon. The next thing is an ability, much like abilities on cards like characters, locations, etc. And this particular one reads, raise the claim value on your reveal plot card by 1 during military challenges in which you are attacking a rival. So if the Tyrell player was doing a military challenge against Baratheon, they would be able to raise their claim by 1. If we go back and look at the plot card that the Tyrell player chose, their claim was 1, but against the Baratheon player this round, this would be a 2, meaning it would be really strong against this particular player. Another thing to notice about this card is that in military challenges, this player adds +1 to the total. So no matter how many characters they attack or defend with, they always add +1 to the total when resolving the challenge. A player would typically choose Master of Ships when trying to clear the board, kill a lot of characters, make the board a little bit cleaner for the next round. And having this extra strength, having extra claim, is a really good way of doing that. Let's look in more detail at what the Hand of the King ability actually does. This one supports the Master of Laws, so it doesn't support this player. Also doesn't support our Lannister player, who was the Master of Coin, which we'll get to in a moment. It does rival the Master of Ships, which is the Tyrell player, and it actually also rivals the Lannister player's Master of Coin. So that means that the Baratheon player is actually rivals with both of his enemies. The ability on this card is you may initiate an additional power challenge during the challenges phase against a different opponent. This is really strong for gaining additional power, which is what the Baratheon player is trying to do with their Clash of Kings plot card, which allows you to steal more power from players. So also at the bottom of this card you may see there is a +1 to power challenges. So Baratheon here is going to be able to do an additional power challenge that will be stronger, and with this plot card potentially take more power. The Lannister players is a little simpler. Let's just make some space. The Master of Coin supports the Master of Ships, which is actually the Tyrell player, and rivals the Hand of the King and the Master of Whispers. So we know that the Hand of the King is the Baratheon player and that they are already rivals. And no ability really here, but +2 gold when collecting income. So now that we know what everybody can do, let's talk about rivals and supports. During the challenges phase, the Lannister player supports the Tyrell player because the Master of Coin supports the Master of Ships. The Baratheon player is rivals to both the Lannister player and the Tyrell player because the Master of Coin and the Master of Ships are rivals to the Hand of the King. So what does this actually mean in combat? Supporting means you cannot attack that player. So in the case of the Lannister player supporting the Tyrell player, the Lannister player cannot initiate a single challenge against the Tyrell player. Which means even if the Tyrell player was winning on the brink of victory, the Lannister player would be pretty much powerless to do anything about it in the challenge phase. That's just tough luck, really. What does rivals mean? Rivals is a little simpler. Basically, if you're rivals with somebody, you can attack them, they can attack you, but if you defeat your opponent in a challenge and they are your rival, you get an additional power. This is a once per round power. You don't get this power every time you do a challenge and succeed against your opponent. So only the first time you succeed in a challenge against a rival do you get that power. But it can add up. It's really good, particularly if you can get this combo going that the Baratheon player has with being able to do an additional power challenge with extra strength with a plot card that suits it. If you get an unopposed challenge, you can do a lot of damage. This is why rushing to victory kind of strategies are pretty popular in Melee, because they're extremely viable and they accelerate very quickly. Let's just have a look at the other titles, and then there will be a few more notes on how to play Melee. So the other three are Master of Whispers, the Crown Regent, and the Master of Laws. Let's talk about these two first and save the Crown Regent for last. The Master of Whispers supports the Hand of the King and rivals the Master of Laws and the Master of Coin. The special ability is you may resolve your intrigue claim against any number of opponents of your choice. So in this particular game, a player who has this title could succeed in a challenge against one player and apply intrigue claim against both opponents. If it was a 4-player game, it could be up to 3 opponents who are suffering the consequences of the failed challenge and defense and having to discard cards. The Master of Laws, it supports the Master of Coin and rivals the Master of Whispers and the Master of Ships, and it simply gives you this cool ability to increase the number of cards you draw in the draw phase by 1, giving you extra draw. While the Master of Whispers gives you +1 in intrigue challenges, the Master of Laws gives you +1 reserve. Give you a bigger hand limit, and reserve can affect other card abilities. You may have noticed that all 5 of these have 1 that they support and 2 that they rival. The only outlier in this situation is the other title, the Crown Regent. This supports none and rivals none, and it allows you to redirect a challenge this round. That's really different to everything else. It also gives you +2 for dominance, so in the dominance phase it might tip you over the opponent's amount to take the power in the dominance phase. It might not, but it's a benefit. Let's talk about the redirect power, which is one of the most interesting aspects of melee. Okay, so in this example, Baratheon player has taken the Crown Regent, the Lannister player has taken Master of Ships, and the Tyrell player has taken Hand of the King. The power behind the redirect is being able to control what your opponents do. In this particular example, there are nobody supports another player, so the players are free to just attack whoever they like. So let's just say the Lannister player decided that they wanted to do a power challenge on the Baratheon player. The Baratheon player doesn't like the idea of that, because they're pretty close to victory. It's pretty simple. The Baratheon player decides, I'm going to use my redirect power. We don't have to kneel these cards, but we tend to do it when we play, just so everybody knows that this has happened. And the Baratheon player then chooses where the challenge is redirected to. In the case of a 3-player game, the only valid redirect here would be to the Tyrell player. So the Lannister's power challenge no longer is against the Baratheon player, but is now against the Tyrell player. Likewise, if, for example, the Baratheon player felt they could defend something important that another player was going to do, let's say the Tyrell player was going to military challenge the Lannister player, really weakening the Lannister player and, you know, turning the tide of battle maybe in the favour of the Tyrells. The Tyrell player initiates a military challenge against Lannister. Baratheon player decides, I'm going to redirect that, and it's going to come to me. The Tyrell's military challenge is now facing against the Baratheon player. Something else to note about this is that if someone was supporting another player, that can very much change with the redirect. In this case, the Lannister player is the Master of Whispers and supports the Hand of the King. The Baratheon player can redirect challenges to mess with that system. If the Lannister player was going to intrigue challenge the Baratheon player because they couldn't do it to who they support, the Baratheon player could redirect that and it would be valid against the Tyrell player, even though the Lannister player supports them. That's totally valid with this. And that's one of the really cool backstabby, intriguey things you can do in melee that you don't get in Joust. And that's kind of it really for melee. There's not a lot more to it than that. If you know how to play Joust, you know how to play melee. Once you understand how these titles work together, how supporting works, that rival thing where you get an extra power, and most importantly this redirect challenge thing. So these titles are pretty cool. I think the system is much better than it was in the first edition, which had these little plastic things instead of the cards. This adds a lot of mystery to what everybody's role is in the melee, and it's pretty cool. A few small notes before we wrap up. If you were doing a 4-player melee, instead of throwing away 2 cards when getting the titles together, you just throw away 1. So it's always number of players plus 1. The first player would look at 5 cards, take 1, pass on until all of them are gone again. And it just behaves the same as a 3-player game otherwise, with supports and rivals and redirects. You can play Melee with more than 4 players. I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's a very long and very complicated game then. But you can do it. If you do 5 players, you use all 6 titles, none get thrown away. First player takes 1, pass them on and so on. If you're playing with 6 or more, you're crazy. 6 players, you can use all 6 titles and all of them are taken. The last player gets no choice, they'll be handed the last one. If you're playing with 7 players or 8 players, which is technically possible, only the first 6 players in initiative order will get titles and 2 players will get nothing. And that's really it. The only other really common rule question that comes up with melee and supporting and all that redirecting sort of stuff is when stealth is involved. Let's just say that you are the Baratheon player and you've decided that you want to attack somebody and you stealth one of their characters, and another player says, no, you're not doing that. I'm going to redirect that challenge. This character's stealth will then be applied to a character on the new person who's being challenged. So if the Baratheon player had been originally targeting the Lannister player here, and the Lannister player didn't want that to happen, and they were the Crown Regent, and they say, no, I don't want that to happen. When the challenge is redirected to the Tyrell player, this Davos Seaworth, his stealth can be applied to a Tyrell character, even if it had been used against a Lannister before that. And that's kind of the main sort of sticky thing that comes up with the redirect. And that is Melee. It's pretty fun. I recommend it. I think it's a very different way of playing Game of Thrones card game. One thing I did forget to mention was that this little Iron Throne token, that can come in pretty handy when you're playing with 3 or more players, just to keep track of who's first and who gets to do things first, particularly when you've got redirecting and rivals, and you know, turns can be quite long and it can be quite easy to forget who went first, particularly in round 5, round 6, etc. So while you might not have used that much in Joust, I think it's a good idea to use it now. Also, the titles, the cards can get pretty beat up. I'm not usually a fan of sleeving things, but I think to avoid seeing little marks and stuff on this, because this is pretty sneaky, intriguey stuff, you might want to sleeve those. I haven't done that because I got a bunch of core sets, so I've got a couple of these. I got 3 sets of these, so I haven't had to do that yet, but I think eventually that might not be a bad idea. So go out, play a melee game of Game of Thrones, experience the fun of redirecting that challenge right at the right time, and tell me that it's not worth it. Yeah, it's great, so do that. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel and get other people to do so. That would be helping me out quite a lot. It'll encourage me to do a lot more, and stay tuned for more videos of this type and for other games too. Thank you.